I'd like to introduce Kamila Piotrowska. So Kamila works for Baker Hughes. She is head of EU Policy and Advocacy. So that is developing policy statements on energy transition subjects and basically shaping Baker Hughes strategies related to climate technologies. Also works in various groups such as Methane Guiding Principles. She has a background from IOGP and also the Pan-European Gas Naturally initiative. So in a nutshell, 12 years of regulatory experience, more than 5 years of which have been in the methane space. So Kamila, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Adam, for this kind introduction. And yeah, my name is Kamila. I'm based in Brussels. And for those who don't know, Baker Hughes is an energy technology company. So feel free to visit our website to learn more. And without further ado, I think I can. Can you please change the slide, Adam? Next slide, please. Yes. Without further ado, let's dive into the presentation. So today's presentation is really about regulations, and I would like to cover regulatory approaches and voluntary initiatives, because you will see there is some type of impact of the voluntary initiatives on the regulations that are being designed by policymakers. And also we are having saying in Brussels that if something one day is voluntary, the next day will become obligatory, mandatory, because it's enforced by legislation. I will also touch upon briefly about Methane Guiding Principles Policy Toolkit, which is a great resource put together by various members of MGP, and you will see, many types of information about policies and also the case studies. So I think if you are on the journey to reduce methane emissions within your organization, it's a good tool for you. And then a couple of conclusions. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Yes, this slide focuses on the voluntary initiatives. Some of them were mentioned by Adam in the previous presentation, but I would like to show you this transition between something being voluntary and then moving to the regulation. And the first initiative, it's GGFR, which you may have heard. It's a global gas flaring reduction partnership. It's the World Bank initiative. And I would say this initiative really shaped various rules on the reduction of flaring. And this initiative brings together various players, so governments, companies, and other organizations. And for example, the World Bank developed like set of definitions on what is routine flaring, what is safety flaring, for example. And this type of definitions quite often, not always, but quite often are used by legislators in the different types of regulations. The next one is the Global Methane Pledge, which was mentioned, referenced by Adam in the previous presentation. So just to let you know, this initiative was driven by the US and the EU, started in 2021, over 150 countries. Some countries are, of course, missing, but I wouldn't be surprised that after COP28, we will see more countries joining this initiative. And even though it's a pledge, meaning that the countries are doing a joint commitment to reduce methane emissions by at least 30% by 2030, this is being checked. And what I mean that by this is being checked, it means that basically different countries, they're explaining how they are trying to contribute to this objective. And of course, how you can do it is to implement policies and regulation aimed at reducing methane emissions. The next one is Oil and Gas Methane Partnership to Zero. So this initiative is quite relevant. It inspired, for example, the EU to base its own legislation on OGMP to zero. Usually it's said that OGMP to zero, it's really like a gold standard. Why is it a gold standard? Because it's based on the measurement of methane emissions. And then everyone who is signing up to this initiative is trying to reach this gold standard. Of course, this is done over a couple of years, so it's not like immediately you need to implement various activities. But it's also a very interesting initiative. So I think if your organization is not a member of it, if I was you, I would definitely take a look at it and see if you would like to join it. So far, 100 companies have joined OGMP 2.0, and they are based in 60 countries. And I would say this family, OGMP 2.0 family, is growing. IEA, so the International Energy Agency, which was also referenced by Adam, they develop extremely useful roadmaps, toolkits for various players who are interested in methane emissions. And at least IEA methane tracker, I must tell you that it triggered a lot of discussion between IEA and the countries, because then the countries saw, oh, my level of methane emissions from, for example, from the oil and gas industry is quite high. I need to have a conversation with IEA to understand how they derive these numbers, and perhaps those numbers need to be improved. The other tool is so-called regulatory roadmap and toolkit. So this is like a sort of document which enables the policymakers to put together policies. And IEA also publishes many different types of reports. MGP, so you have joined us today. So it was already mentioned by Kamila and by Adam as well. So I will not be talking about it. The next initiative is actually Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, which is a CEO-led initiative. And what is quite interesting that OGCI established a target of 0.2% for methane intensity. And this target, for example, is now these days heavily debated in the EU during the discussions on the EU legislation on methane emissions. So that's why I'm saying that, you know, all these different voluntary initiatives, they are sort of source of inspirations for policymakers. OGCI also established the satellite campaign. So basically, this works in a way that the satellites are spotting, you know, for example, super emitters, and afterwards there is engagement with companies and also with governments. And what was mentioned at the end by Adam, it was the aiming for zero initiative, which I also would kindly invite you to take a look and see if this is of interest to your organization. So we can go to the next slide, please. So this slide outlines different types of regulatory options. This is based on the IEA regulatory roadmap. And here you can see that really different countries, depending on their journey to reduce methane emissions, they can introduce various types of policies. It's a very theoretical framework, but I will give you also examples how this type of, let's say, theory can be introduced in practice. So the first one is really like prescriptive tools. Prescriptive legislation is really about command and control requirements. And for example, usually this type of legislation requires companies to undertake particular actions. So, you know, it's extremely detailed legislation. You know exactly what you need to do because a particular law is telling you A, B, C, D. And as far as examples are concerned, so operator may need to replace pneumatic controllers with lower emitting controllers by a certain date. And one of the examples which I identified, it was like a legislation from the US state of Maryland, which requires operators to convert all continuous bleed devices to be converted to electric or compressed air powered devices. So this is the first type. The second one is performance or outcome based. Usually the industry prefers this type of legislation because it provides you the flexibility what to do and how to tackle methane emissions. So this type of legislation tells you you have a target and you need to reach this target, but you can determine the ways of how you are planning to reach the target. And in these cases, usually you need to establish a baseline, right? Because you need to know how you are progressing towards the reduction of methane emissions. Example of this policies is actually Mexico's regulation, which is considered to be one of the most ambitious one in Latin America. So companies need to determine like a baseline and also establish the plan how they are planning to reduce methane emissions. The other one could be considered like, you know, in Colorado, there is a regulation which says that flares need to be designed to achieve 98% efficiency. The third category is economic incentives. And economic incentives, basically, they can be considered, you know, the taxes. So if you emit methane emissions, you need to pay. An example we have in Norway, because in Norway, the carbon tax covers also methane emissions from offshore oil and gas facilities, or the heavily debated the US methane fee. The last category is information-based. So information-based, it means basically that companies, entities, they need to provide some type of information which is required by the regulators. And once, let's say, regulators, policymakers gather the information, for example, on the level of methane emissions, then they may decide to establish other tools to tackle methane emissions. And one of the examples could be like the US Environment Protection Agency GHG reporting program, which requires companies to report on the emissions. In other cases, could be that the UK government is asking operators to provide information or obtain consent before they do flaring or venting. And we can go to the next slide, please. So moving from this theoretical framework, which, as I mentioned, you know, it can be adopted by various countries, and it really depends on where the countries are with their policies. And each, of course, each of this type of theoretical approaches has different types of advantages and disadvantages. And here on the slide, you can see different types of policies. And this is really like a snapshot. And I would say this is non-exhaustive because there are for sure more requirements. But let's make this type of tour around the world and start with the North America. And we will kick off with Canada, from where TC Energy kindly is hosting us. So in Canada, there are already targets to reduce methane emissions by 2025, by 2030. And there are many different types of regulations to reduce methane emissions. Excuse me. In the US, we already have regulation in place. As I told you before, it's about reporting on methane emissions, but there are new changes coming in. And we may see also methane fee in the US. Mexico already also alluded to this. Very prescriptive, very detailed legislation, also with targets. If we go to South America, so for example, in Colombia, they already have legislation and LDAR programs in place since 2022. And they have some requirements that, for example, there is a need to install vapor units to capture fugitives. Brazil also has some procedures to tackle emissions, for example, from flaring, and they may also decide to apply some sanctions. Argentina, very interesting case because they have just started working on a bill which is going to cover LDAR programs, monitoring and reporting on emissions, and very likely this legislation will be finalized by 2024. Now let's move to Africa. In Africa, I pointed out here 2 countries. The first one is Nigeria, which has it's a very interesting case. They have guidelines and they also have financial incentives to reduce flaring. Egypt, they just developed a roadmap to reduce methane emissions in the oil and gas industry. Then, if we go to the EU, so the EU, and I will talk a little bit about it later, the EU is working on the legislation, and the intention is to base this legislation on OGMP to 0. But on top of it, there are already some LDAR programs that exist at national level. UK, which is not part of the EU anymore, they have some rules as well. They have some guidance on flaring and venting. Norway, I previously mentioned, they have like economic incentives because the methane emissions is captured by the carbon tax. But on top of it, for example, flaring is banned. They need to follow a couple of guidelines. And then if we go to Asia, so in China at least, they have the 5-year plan and they want to start control over methane emissions. Some companies, they decided to create an alliance to address methane emissions. So, you know, different countries, different approaches. In Vietnam, there are also some restrictions on flaring. The same applies to Indonesia. And in Australia, for example, we have various types of emissions reporting obligations, and not only at a federal level, but also at a state level. We can go to the next slide, please. So this is a little bit more in further details, you know, all these different types of legislation. I will not go through all of these elements, but just to point it out that, for example, Canada, and to show you as well how dynamic the space is, that there are so many different changes. For example, Canada is developed a white paper where they stated that they want to further reduce methane emissions by at least 75% by 2030. And they outline a set of different actions. For example, they want to do annual inspections for methane emissions of non-producing wells. The law is expected to publish sometime in 2023. I think what is very interesting about the US, as a part of the Inflation Reduction Act, they proposed a methane fee, which is quite innovative. And usually the US, you know, they don't have, for example, a direct carbon price in place like is in the EU or in Norway, but they are thinking about methane fee. And here is written that, you know, for example, companies would need to pay $900 per ton of methane emissions, which is emitted in 2024. And then afterwards, this amount is going to increase. This law is still not in place, and the rules are expected by the end of 2023. Nigeria, so I mentioned to you that there are some programs to reduce flaring. When I was talking in the past to some people who work and live in Nigeria, they told me that the program is working quite well and they managed to reduce flaring, because if you flare, you need to pay for it. And then Australia, as I mentioned, there is a lot of reporting obligations. So Adam, we can go to the next slide, please. This slide talks about the EU. So to give you some highlights from the EU, the EU's legislation, which is still not finalized, we expect to be finalized before COP28 or perhaps at the beginning of next year. But overall, the intention is to cover upstream oil and gas, inactive wells, transmission and distributions from the gas sector. But at the same time, what Adam was saying at the beginning, you know, coal sector is also responsible for methane emissions. So the EU wants to capture methane emissions from, for example, from abandoned coal mines. And as I said, this legislation is based on OGMP to 0. So it's not literally copy and paste, but all the principles and the templates from OGMP to 0 will be introduced by the EU law. There are also some types of standards for flaring and venting, such as on combustion efficiency. There will be requirement for elder surveys, and there will be requirements for imported gas. What does this mean in practice? That if a company A in the EU will be buying LNG, for example, from Qatar or from the US, they will need to gather information on the methane regulations that exist in the US or in Qatar. And as I said, this legislation is still not in place, but the final law is expected to be published before COP28 or in 2024. And it will take some time, but very likely it will enter into force in 2025. We can go to the next slide, please. And this is the slide what I mentioned about the Methane Policy Toolkit, which I kindly invite you to visit because it contains a lot of information about various initiatives and regulations from various countries, and also case studies, because case studies, explaining how particular standards can be achieved is extremely critical to even convince internally, to join this pathway, the reduction of methane emissions. And we can go to the last slide, please. And in terms of the conclusions, so what was pointed out by Adam before, the reduction of methane emissions is really important. And I usually say this is really like a low-hanging fruit, which can help us to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. And there are many different regulations and voluntary measures, and the picture is very dynamic, as I showed you, that, various countries are having some regulations, and afterwards they decide to refresh them or introduce new ones. Other countries, they are trying to develop new proposals and so on. So this type of initiatives, whether it's a voluntary one or legally binding, will bring us on the pathway to reduce methane emissions.